The story of how the US dollar became the world's reserve currency begins not with America's rise, but with the world's fall into chaos. It is a story of power, war, and trust, a story that shaped the modern global economy. But it wasn't always this way. At the dawn of the 20th century, it was not the dollar that ruled the world, it was the British pound sterling. Back then, the British Empire stretched across the globe. Its colonies spanned continents, its navy commanded the seas, and its currency, the pound, was accepted almost everywhere. The British economy was built on trade, and because of that, the pound was backed by one thing that gave it unmatched stability: gold. For over a century, the world operated on what was known as the gold standard, a system where every unit of currency could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. It ensured discipline, trust, and predictability in global trade. But then came 1914, and with it, World War I. The war was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Nations poured every resource into it: men, machines, and money. To finance their militaries, European powers printed more currency than their gold reserves could support. They went deep into debt. And as the war dragged on, many countries suspended the gold standard entirely. Inflation soared, and trust in European currencies began to crumble. Across the Atlantic, however, the United States stayed out of the war at first. Instead, it supplied food, steel, weapons, and loans to the Allies, demanding payment in gold. By the time the war ended in 1918, the US held nearly half of the world's gold reserves. The dollar was gaining strength, while the pound began to waver. The 1920s brought temporary prosperity, but it was short-lived. The Great Depression of 1929 shook the world's confidence in all currencies. Nations devalued their money to boost exports, leading to instability everywhere. And then, just as the global economy began to recover, World War II erupted in 1939. Europe once again fell into chaos. Cities were bombed, industries destroyed, and gold reserves drained to pay for the war effort. But once again, the United States became the world's supplier, selling weapons, food, and fuel to its allies. And in return, it received gold. By the time the war ended in 1945, the United States owned 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. Its industries were untouched by war, its economy was booming, and its gold vaults were fuller than ever. As the dust settled, world leaders knew something had to be done to rebuild trust in the global financial system. So in July 1944, 44 nations gathered in a quiet mountain town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. For 3 weeks, economists and diplomats debated the future of international finance. And from that meeting came the Bretton Woods Agreement, a system that would define the global economy for decades. Under this new system, all major currencies would be pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar itself would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. In short, the dollar became as good as gold. America's gold-backed dollar became the anchor of global trade, and the world rebuilt under this system. Germany and Japan rose from the ashes with American help. Europe recovered through the Marshall Plan, financed in US dollars. And global financial institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, IMF, were born, both centered around the US dollar. For nearly 3 decades, the Bretton Woods system worked, until the cracks began to show. By the late 1960s, the US faced mounting costs from the Vietnam War, the space race, and expansive domestic spending. The government printed more money to cover its bills, but the amount of gold in Fort Knox didn't increase. Countries began to notice. Foreign governments, especially France under President Charles de Gaulle, started demanding gold in exchange for their dollars, as the system allowed. Gold reserves began to dwindle. The promise of converting dollars into gold was becoming impossible to keep. Then, in August 1971, President Richard Nixon made a historic announcement. He ended the convertibility of the US dollar into gold, which effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. The world had entered a new financial era, one where the US dollar was no longer backed by gold, but by trust. This move could have destroyed the dollar's dominance, but something else happened instead. In the 1970s, the US government struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer. In exchange for American military protection and economic support, Saudi Arabia agreed to sell oil exclusively in US dollars. Soon after, other members of OPEC followed. This created the petrodollar system, a new foundation for the dollar's global dominance. Because every nation needed oil and oil was priced in dollars, countries around the world began storing large amounts of US currency in their central banks. This kept global demand for dollars high, even without gold backing it. Over time, the US dollar became more than just a currency. It became the world's financial language. From commodities like oil and gold to international loans and trade settlements, the dollar was everywhere. Today, nearly 60% of the world's foreign exchange reserves are still held in US dollars. It remains the currency of global trust, born from war, built on gold, and sustained by energy and economic power. About 90% of international trade transactions involve the dollar in some way. Even nations that oppose US policies still rely on it for trade and stability. The rise of the dollar wasn't just about economics. It was about trust, power, and influence. The world turned to the US because it offered something few others could, that is, stability. Yet, as new economic powers emerge, like China, India, and regional alliances, the dominance of the dollar faces new challenges. Discussions of de-dollarization and alternative trade systems are growing louder. But for now, the US dollar remains the heartbeat of the global economy, a currency born from war, built on gold, and sustained by energy, trust, and unmatched global influence.